Welcome to the Bill Sang Podcast. My name is Bill Sang, and we're still going through our series on the proof of God, namely through my book, The 10 Irrefutable Proofs of Creation. And I wrote this book a good while ago, but I still think that it provides a pretty strong foundation for proofs for God. And today we're going into a very complicated topic. I might even have to reference my book a couple of times as we're talking about it because we are on the topic of DNA. And you hear the term DNA thrown out a lot these days. For quite some time, ever since the movie Jurassic Park came out. You remember how they mined the mosquitoes out of the ground, covered in amber, took out the blood, and inside the blood, you're able to find dinosaur DNA. So they're able to assemble dinosaurs from this DNA because the DNA is the building blocks of life. Well, what DNA is, I'll just read from my book because I give a pretty basic description of what DNA is. DNA is the shortened name for deoxyribonucleic acid. According to the Genetics Home Reference, DNA is hereditary material. It is found inside of every cell of an organism and is nearly identical in every single one. DNA is wrapped into a double helix formation, and along its spine are four chemical bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. The sequence of these bases determines what information is necessary. Without DNA, the construction of proteins required for specific tasks would be impossible because it indeed contains the blueprints for all necessary proteins. So DNA is a very vital part to any sort of living thing, as it basically determines what you're going to look like, what you're going to be. Just about every little detail that there is about you is determined by your DNA. And there's a lot deeper conversation in relation to that. One of the really controversial things that came up a while back was this concept of junk DNA. You see, that a lot of people have claimed within the past few hundred years that there's vestigial components of living things. For instance, if you are aware of your appendix or your tonsils, there are some people that would claim those are vestigial organs, meaning they're a vestige of the past, meaning that at some stage in our evolutionary development, that those lost function, but they remain because they once had a function, but now they do not have a function. Well, that's just not true. But they were claiming that there is such thing as junk DNA, which they are saying was a vestige of our past evolutionary history. That at one point in time, this DNA had a particular function to it, but now it's not necessary because we've evolved past that stage in our evolutionary history. Well, the funny thing is that actually junk DNA does not really exist. We could still call it junk DNA if we want, but it's just that it's non-coding DNA. So it doesn't perform the same function as the rest of our DNA, but it is still functional in you today as you exist. And so it's not something that's a vestige of the past. It's actually an essential part of your DNA. It just makes the whole conversation of DNA all the more complicated. Bill Gates and other software engineers have said that DNA functions a lot like computer software, computer programming software. It's very, very sophisticated and it's very intentional. So you can tell that it has some intelligence behind it. It knows what it is doing. And if you look at Stephen Meyer from the intelligent design movement, he makes a very strong case that DNA is not something that just could have evolved. It's something that had to be structured very intentionally because of how it operates. When you think about it, nothing would be able to come to be. It would be able to exist, would be able to replicate, would be able to reproduce unless there was some intentionality inside of our DNA. If there's no intentionality in all of the inside of your chromosomes and so forth that are necessary for us to be able to carry out the process of reproduction. There has to be something that has a blueprint for the organism that's going to come forth. Otherwise, everything would be random, and most of the things that would come out of us would be dead. And so there wouldn't be any real possibility that something could procreate unless the DNA did contain this blueprints that's very specifically designated that, when people reproduce, well, they produce people. When animals reproduce, depending on what kind of animal, it produces that kind of animal. When plants reproduce, it produces that kind of plant. So it's pretty simple in that regard. And also, when it comes to DNA, it's something that when we look at it with how sophisticated it is, there's the math has been done. I'll put it like that. And the odds of DNA evolving out of nothing, considering all the factors, everything that has to come together just right, and all the things that be functioning at the same time, that it is actually irreducibly complex, and thus DNA, there is a 0% chance of it being able to evolve from inanimate materials. Even people like Lawrence Krauss has conceded this point that the chances of evolution are essentially zero. Why is it that Lawrence Krauss still believes in evolution? Well, at the end of the day, uh, you have to concede that all of existence, all things that happen, are not a matter of chance, but rather a matter of whether it really happened or not. So Lawrence Krauss, he says that, well, it's not a matter of odds, it's just a matter that it really did happen. And given long enough, they would say that, okay, well, it's going to happen. But at a 0% chance, where it's so ridiculously small percentage of a chance that this is going to happen, the fact there's life anywhere at all, namely on planet Earth, is just absolutely remarkable. And it's nowhere short of miraculous. And so when you look at DNA, Stephen Meyer refers to it as the signature on the cell, meaning that is God's signature, saying that, hey, when you look at living things, when you look at yourself and you realize that there is DNA inside of you to make sure that you're looking the way that the DNA dictates, that is a sign that our Creator is actually the one really in control and has created all things. I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's edition of the Bill Saying podcast. You can check this podcast out. You can check out this podcast at williamhsang.com. You can find it on Facebook or YouTube. You can check it out on Apple Podcasts, anywhere where you can find podcasts. I'd like to thank you for joining me for today for the Bill Saying podcast and this series on the proof of God.